The government is making it harder for you to vote. Why? The government earlier this year passed the Elections Act 2022, which was again voted on in Parliament on Monday. Now, this specifies that from next May, every voter will be required to produce photo ID in order to vote. Now, in one sense, that doesn't sound like such a big deal, does it? It might even sound like it makes sense, except that we've never had a history of that in this country, apart from in Northern Ireland, where there are specific circumstances. So this is a huge change to our electoral law. The main problem is we don't have any form of free universal ID in this country. So there are millions of people, especially poorer people, especially younger people, some ethnic minorities as well, who are just less likely to have, say, a driving licence or a passport. This has led the government's critics, including Labour's Angela Rayner, to accuse ministers of trying to make it harder for non-Conservative voters who are probably more likely not to have ID to vote.
The regulations before us today arise from a slapdash, short-sighted and politically motivated act which turns the clock back on democratic progress.
Consider too that in terms of the ID the government says will be acceptable, that too seemed weighted in favour of older people, when the government revealed that, say, older people would be able to use their 60-plus travel cards, but that younger people would not. Now, if we had a system of ID cards for all, like they do in, say, France, it would be much easier, but we don't. One study also suggested that even if you do have ID, about 4% of people were not recognisable in their photographs, and that could lead to confusion as well as pressure on polling station staff. And indeed, where compulsory voter ID has been piloted, something which happened in a few local places back in 2018, around 1,000 people were turned away because they did not have the right form of identification, and around a third, perhaps unsurprisingly, didn't bother to come back. Bear in mind that turnout in local elections in particular is already very low. The turnout in this year's locals was about 32%. Do we really want to do anything which risks lowering it? Now, the government says that people will be able to apply for a form of local voter ID from their council, but that is an extra layer of bureaucracy to go through. And given that there are around 46 million or so people on the UK electoral register, and the government says that voting cards will cost 25 pence per year per voter, then over the next 10 years, that could cost around £116 million. So why is the government doing it at all?
Voter fraud is a crime that we cannot allow room for, and we must stamp out any potential for it to take place in elections. Strengthening the integrity of our system will give the public confidence that our elections remain secure well into the future, and everybody who is eligible to vote will be able to continue doing so.
So ministers say they're doing it because they want to clamp down on voter fraud. But the argument would be that that is a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Consider that according to the House of Commons Library, there have only been 4 convictions for personation of voters in the last 10 years, i.e. since 2012. That is out of more than 242 million votes cast in the last decade across all elections in the UK. The general election of 2019 saw millions of votes cast, but just 1 police caution for using someone else's vote. Research from Newcastle University suggested that of 5,000 polling officers asked, only 0.7% thought there had been some form of electoral fraud. And even here, it was cited that it was probably inadvertent, because here's the thing. Voter impersonation is not a very good way of trying to throw an election. There's a strong chance you might get caught. The person you're pretending to be could have already voted. Someone at the polling station might already recognise you. You're only going to throw 1 or 2 votes at a time. What's the point? There have been higher profile examples of voter fraud, but that rarely involves voter impersonation. And this is why David Davis MP, the Conservative former Brexit secretary, and the only Tory to vote against proceeding with voter ID on Monday, wrote earlier this year, in short, voter ID is an illiberal policy in pursuit of a non-existent problem. The Local Government Association, and remember it is local government which basically administers elections, have called for a deferral. Councillor Jamie Jamieson, a Tory, has said that the organisation thinks that the law should not be changed within 6 months of an election that the change would impact. Now, the government argues that this will augment the legitimacy of our elections. There is a strong case, though, if hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people are potentially denied the right to vote, either because they don't have the right ID or they have no ID at all, or they don't even know they'll need ID, that it will be possible that it does precisely the opposite and diminish the legitimacy instead. Now, many people also look nervously across the pond to where voter ID requirements in certain US states have led to accusations of election throwing.
I'm the President of the United States. I just went through a rigged election, and I have no standing.
Now, the US and the south of the US in particular has a long history of such things, and that isn't the case here. But it does remind us that the right to vote is sacrosanct, and any changes can at least lead to accusations which call into question legitimacy, which is the thing in elections that matters most. Voting isn't like things you might need ID for in other cases, like buying a bottle of wine or driving a car. It is fundamental, and anything which makes it harder has to be supported by the most compelling of cases. And many would say that that case here has not been made.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.